to fumble their way towards some kind of agreement on what on earth to do about Libya?
I don't think there will be an international consensus around specific steps that will be taken to deal with Libya or Gaddafi from this point on. What we're likely to observe, however, are areas of consensus where you would have organizations that are given a mandate to deal with certain issues. So on human rights violations, particular organizations will focus. If there are any needs of help in logistics, tracking of lost funds, on the core issues that are of primary importance at the moment, which is securing stability in Libya, perhaps preventing Gaddafi from engaging in a last act of desperate bloodshed, and ensuring that the supply of oil continues without any effects on international oil markets. I would expect the US and the Europeans to take the lead, with the US essentially setting the tone. That need not be a UN-mandated action, but it can be an action that the UN blesses.
How far do you think these organizations are looking at, for example, I know humanitarian concerns obviously are high on the agenda. There is also an issue about the supply of oil. Most of the eastern oil fields are said to be under the control of rebels. We're just getting a line through from news agency Reuters saying the oil terminal town of Brega is under rebel control. And the supply of crude seems to have slowed right down. So how much concern is that going to cause and add impetus to whatever decision they come to?
I think the concern over what happens to oil markets on account of what is taking place in Libya is paramount. It matters. Oil prices have moved by about $10 just in the last 2 weeks. Should any of these oil installations be affected, be destroyed, and now with the exodus of foreign nationals who operate a lot of these terminals, you're seeing gradual pressure and worries, frankly, that have to do with the international economic system and what events in Libya mean for that. Added to it, growing, escalating, and visible concerns about the humanitarian conditions in Libya. Libya has over 2 million foreign nationals. Many of the Egyptians' foreign nationals are now choosing to leave the country through Tunisia as opposed to Egypt. That suggests that the country is breaking apart and you might have a humanitarian crisis that is brewing. We've seen also suggestions that Gaddafi might be preparing for the last battle. That's what he suggested.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about this because analysts are saying that, analysts who know him say that rather than him giving up, he would rather mount a last stand and lose everything, raise everything to the ground, than be seen to give in. Do you think that's true?
I think that's very true. That's very possible, although his ability to do this is gradually diminishing. Many of his top lieutenants are defecting. The international community is beginning to express some implicit red lines about what is possible, what is not possible. The idea of a no-fly zone seems like an idea that people are discussing. You had the American administration for the first time yesterday saying that they're looking at all options, including a military option.
Well, NATO was saying, yes, there's an emergency NATO meeting, and military intervention is something that may be discussed, although no one's sort of come right out and said, yeah, this is definitely an option. Is that something that the Libyan people would welcome, though? I
don't think the Libyan people would welcome foreign presence, foreign military personnel on their soil, nor does anyone hope to see an intervention that would in fact require Libyan territory being occupied or isolated. However, Libyans are cognizant of the fact that the outside world is partly complicit in the durability and the ability of this regime to conduct precisely the sort of policies we're seeing on the ground in Libya. And so what they're asking for are the sort of policies, positions, and perhaps interventions that will prevent Gaddafi from causing further bloodshed and hastening his exit from the scene. That is possible without requiring foreign troops or foreign military intervention. I think we're seeing in many ways events that resemble what happened in Iraq post the first Gulf War, when a no-fly zone was imposed, simply because Saddam Hussein was targeting the civilians who protested against him both in the south and in the Kurdish areas, and hence a no-fly zone was imposed to protect civilians. That's a symbolic gesture that may not in fact require too much effort, but could tip the balance in favor of the revolution and in favor of bringing the country to stability soon without Gaddafi in charge.
How do you assess the momentum of the protests? Because he remains strong in Tripoli. but we've seen huge swathes of the rest of the country falling to the protesters. So how do you assess the movement that's taking place?
I think we're seeing greater consolidation of the protests and controlled by the revolution in the eastern and western part, the furthest most western parts of the country. We're seeing also diminishing control within Tripoli. Tripoli reported today a number of open skirmishes, protests and violent responses by the security personnel. That suggests that even within Tripoli, his hold on power might be weakening. I think added to it the fact that we're hearing openly now names of high-ranking officers who either plan to defect or have defected, senior political personnel within the establishment coming out, condemning recent events in Libya. That is also signaling to me that even within the core constituency around Gaddafi, that remain the key to holding on to Tripoli and launching any counterattack, that power base is disintegrating before our eyes.
And that power base and remaining loyalty to Gaddafi is something I want to discuss with you a little later on. But for the moment, thanks very much indeed, Tariq Youssef from Brookings there. Well, international pressure on Libya is mounting, but the protests seem to be intensifying. Al Jazeera's Lawrence Lee has more.
More and more footage emerges of triumphalist scenes from Benghazi in the east of Libya, suggesting Gaddafi's forces have lost half their country. Pictures of crowds dwarf anything Libyan state television can provide of pro-Gaddafi support. Friday prayers in Benghazi have seen thousands and thousands on the streets. All the banners are for the benefit of the capital. We're with you, Tripoli. In the town of Derna as well, Friday prayers were followed by a sea of placards which barely need explaining. It all adds to the sense that Gaddafi and whatever's left of his support base are under more pressure than ever. Still, the fighting goes on in parts of the west. According to Gaddafi, these people are either members of Al-Qaeda or high on hallucinogenic drugs. Some of them are certainly in terrible pain. They're people from the town of AlJazeera who tried to fight Gaddafi's forces when they stormed the town. In his telephone address to AlJazeera on Libyan television, Gaddafi seemed to imply that they deserved it.
The demands come from bin Laden. You, Zawiya people, are substituting the popular and Jamahiriya system with bin Laden. Bin Laden cells have been operating here for months. His operatives are provoking and brainwashing your children, inciting them to launch attacks. The enemy perpetrating the killings of our children, operating from mosques or elsewhere. Bin Laden and his operatives are providing your children with hallucination pills.
Gaddafi's apparently relaxed attitude to the violence, some of the allegations by Libyan witnesses, the images of death and mutilation too shocking to show, are all the kind of thing that some in the outside world say need to be investigated as potential crimes against humanity. So, pressure from the east of Libya, pressure from outside the country, and pressure too from his own loyalists, who desert him now with regularity.
What happened and is happening are massacres and bloodshed never witnessed by the Libyan people. The logic of power and violence is being imposed instead of seeking democratic, free, and mutual dialogue. And because what is happening in Libya today is against the principles of truth and justice, which I believe in, I therefore confirm my resignation from the post of the chief prosecutor in Libya.
Other pictures are emerging which seem to undermine Gaddafi's claims of the prospects of civil war if he goes. Here in Tobruk, where protesters apparently overran the army, locals say national unity against Gaddafi is more important than tribal allegiance.
It's true we are tribes, but we are united. There are good relations here. We meet and cooperate. We're working together. We will not conspire or fight each other. When push comes to shove, we are united.
The people of Tripoli, meanwhile, got this from Libyan state TV, a sermon that wasn't overtly pro-Gaddafi, but which had this apparent warning from the Quran to the people of the uprising.
As the Prophet Messenger said, if you dislike your ruler or his behaviors, you should not raise your sword against him, but be patient, for those who disobey the rulers will die as infidels.
What this congregation or others like them in the capital make of it all in the hours and days to come may well be critical. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera.
Now, the United Nations Human Rights Council is based in Geneva and is holding an emergency meeting. Nick Spicer is there for us. Nick, first of all, I gather there's been a statement by the Libyan delegation to the Human Rights Council. What can you tell us?
Well, the Libyan envoy to the UN surprised us all and told the Human Rights Council that he and others at the Libyan embassy here in Geneva represent only the Libyan people and not the regime. In other words, we're not working for the government anymore. And all day, well, throughout the morning, their chair had been empty at the Human Rights Council. We were speculating, of course, it was because they were actually discussing whether or not Libya should continue to be a member, given what the president of the council called crimes against humanity ongoing in the country. And I guess now we have an answer as to why that chair was empty, so it's a surprise.
Yeah, that's interesting. And we know that the council is discussing what to do, particularly about the humanitarian situation inside Libya, with huge concerns about the way protesters are being dealt with. What possible scenarios are they coming up with?
Well, they're looking at two things. One of them is suspending Libya from the council, which will be in New York. It really isn't going to help anybody in Libya. Secondly, they're talking about setting up an international investigation into what is going on there, since people who will look for forensic evidence or telecommunications evidence or all kinds of evidence that the government perpetrated crimes against humanity or war crimes against its own people. And the idea is just that very announcement will serve to intimidate the people who are perpetrating these crimes. So it's not a military intervention, it's sort of a judicial intervention, if you will, a promise that there will be consequences for those people who are engaging in the acts that are being deployed here in Geneva.
OK, Nick, thanks very much indeed for that. Nick Spicer updating us on the Human Rights Council meeting in Geneva. So live pictures coming out of Libya. Well, we're hearing of clashes between police and demonstrators in Tripoli. Difficult to get information out of there because communications are so restricted. But various towns, particularly in the east of Libya, are in the hands of protesters, of anti-government demonstrators, who say that they will continue protesting until the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi quits. Let's go back to our studio guest, Tariq Youssef, who's Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute in Washington, but with us here in Doha. We were talking about the increasing defections from security forces from the army against Gaddafi joining the protesters. Now, the thing about Gaddafi is he doesn't really rely that much on his army, does he? He's got his elite forces, his Presidential Guard and his Revolutionary Guard and his paramilitary brigades, some of which are led by members of his family.
True, hence the worry still that he might come back with a